The morning air is still. Late summer, 1943. Somewhere in the American Midwest, beyond miles of farmland and rail lines, a prisoner of war camp awakes to routine. Barbed wire catches the first light of dawn. Guard towers stand silent, their silhouettes unbroken. Inside the compound, Japanese prisoners rise from wooden barracks, folding blankets with practiced precision. No one speaks. Eyes move instead, watching. Across the fence line, U.S. Army guards change shifts. They stand straight but relaxed. Rifles are slung without ceremony. One laughs quietly, another adjusts his helmet. A corporal checks a clipboard, then slips a folded pay envelope into his pocket. Cigarette smoke drifts upward. A portable radio murmurs faintly, carrying music from somewhere far beyond the wire. The prisoners notice everything. The guards are disciplined, yet unafraid, obedient, yet casual. They follow rules but speak freely. They enforce captivity, then walk away from it at the end of the day. For men raised to believe surrender erased honor, this scene is unsettling. Not cruelty, but restraint. Not chaos, but a strange, ordinary freedom. And in that contrast, something begins to quietly fracture. The world the prisoners came from. Long before the barbed wire, before the watchtowers and guard schedules, the men inside American POW camps carried another enclosure with them, one built from belief, obligation, and fear. To understand what they saw in their American captors, it is necessary to understand what they had been taught to see themselves. Imperial Japan entered the 20th century with a military culture forged in rapid modernization and selective tradition. By the 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had become not only instruments of state power, but moral institutions. Service was not simply duty, it was identity. The soldier existed as an extension of the emperor's will, bound by loyalty that transcended life itself. At the heart of this worldview was a reinterpreted concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior. Once a loose ethical framework for samurai conduct, it was transformed into a rigid state doctrine. Obedience was absolute, endurance was sacred, death was preferable to capture. Surrender was not merely failure, it was moral collapse. This belief was reinforced through training that emphasized humiliation as discipline. Recruits were beaten by superiors, starved to build resilience, and taught to suppress individuality. Rank determined worth. Orders were followed without question. Compassion was weakness. The enemy, once defined, was subhuman. By the time Japan entered full-scale war in the Pacific in December 1941, this ideology was deeply entrenched. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor unleashed a campaign marked by speed, aggression, and early success. Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, overwhelming colonial defenses in Hong Kong, Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. Victory reinforced belief. Belief hardened into certainty. Japanese soldiers saw themselves as elite, morally superior, spiritually stronger, immune to the softness they attributed to Western armies. American soldiers, in particular, were portrayed as undisciplined, indulgent, and lacking the will to endure hardship. Propaganda depicted them as materially rich but spiritually hollow. Men who fought for pay rather than honor. Yet the Pacific War quickly became a war of attrition. By mid-1942, the strategic balance began to shift. The Battle of Midway in June halted Japanese naval expansion. The grinding campaign on Guadalcanal revealed the limits of Japan's logistics and manpower. Disease, starvation, and relentless American firepower took a mounting toll. Still,
Surrender remained unthinkable. Japanese field manuals explicitly instructed soldiers never to allow themselves to be captured. Those who could not fight were expected to die. Wounded men were often left behind rather than evacuated. Units conducted suicidal attacks rather than retreat. This was not irrationality, it was indoctrination made operational. As a result, Japanese prisoners of war were exceedingly rare in the early years of the conflict. Those who did survive capture often did so unconsciously, wounded, shell-shocked, or physically unable to resist. Others were taken at sea, pulled from sinking ships, or captured in isolated skirmishes where escape or death was impossible. For these men, captivity carried a weight far heavier than chains. They believed themselves already dead. Letters from home would never come. Families would be informed of their honorable death. Names would be removed from registers. In Japan, captured soldiers were often erased from memory, their existence an embarrassment to the national narrative. And so, when these men were transported across the Pacific, blindfolded, silent, and filled with dread, they did not expect mercy. They expected punishment, beatings, forced labor, execution. What they encountered instead was something they had never been trained to comprehend: a system governed by written rules, guards who followed procedure, an enemy that fed them, registered them, and assigned them numbers, not as a prelude to violence, but to administration. This collision between expectation and reality did not immediately bring relief. It brought suspicion. Because in the Japanese military mind, kindness from an enemy was not benevolence, it was deception. And as the prisoners were processed into a growing network of camps across the United States, that suspicion would be tested against a reality that challenged everything they believed about power, discipline, and control.
The system they entered. The men who arrived in the United States as prisoners of war did not step into chaos. They entered a system already mapped, regulated, and bound by law. For the Japanese POWs who survived capture and transport across the Pacific, this alone was disorienting. The United States was a signatory to the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. While Japan had signed but not ratified the convention, American policy still adhered to its provisions, not out of sentimentality, but strategy. Washington understood that how it treated enemy prisoners would shape how American soldiers might be treated if captured abroad. Law was leverage. By 1942, the War Department had established an extensive POW infrastructure stretching across the continental United States. More than 500 camps, main installations, and branch facilities were built in remote areas, often far from population centers. Texas, Oklahoma, Arizona, Arkansas, Wisconsin, and Mississippi became unlikely custodians of Axis prisoners. Most camps were originally designed for German and Italian POWs. Japanese prisoners arrived later and in far smaller numbers. By war's end, the United States would hold over 370,000 Axis POWs. Fewer than 6,000 were Japanese. That imbalance mattered. German POWs were generally treated as conventional soldiers who expected captivity as a risk of war. Japanese prisoners were seen as ideologically volatile, psychologically fragile, and potentially dangerous to themselves and others. As a result, they were often segregated into specific compounds or camps where cultural tensions could be managed more closely. Upon arrival, prisoners were processed with methodical precision. Names were recorded, personal items cataloged, medical examinations conducted. They were issued clothing, bedding, and identification numbers. Rules were explained, sometimes through translators, sometimes through posted notices they could not yet read. There were no beatings, no ritual humiliation, no arbitrary punishment. For many prisoners, this absence was unsettling. The guards who enforced these camps were not elite combat troops.
Most were older soldiers, medically unfit for frontline service, or young men awaiting overseas deployment. Some were National Guard units federalized for wartime duty. Others were reassigned from training commands. Their job was not to terrorize prisoners, but to manage them. They were instructed to be firm, consistent, and restrained. Discipline was enforced through regulation. Infractions resulted in loss of privileges, confinement, or formal charges, not violence. Guards were prohibited from striking prisoners except in self-defense. Firearms were present but rarely used. Authority came from predictability, not fear. This approach extended into daily life. Prisoners received regular meals that met U.S. Army nutritional standards. While unfamiliar and sometimes unpalatable, rations were sufficient. Red Cross parcels supplemented diets. Medical care was available, including surgery and dental treatment. Religious practice was permitted. Chaplains visited camps. Buddhist and Shinto observances were allowed when possible. Labor was required but regulated. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted POWs could be compelled to work provided the labor was not directly related to the war effort. Japanese prisoners were assigned to agricultural work, timber cutting, road maintenance, and camp upkeep. For this, they were paid a small wage, usually 80 cents per day, credited to individual accounts. The money could be used at camp canteens to purchase toiletries, snacks, writing materials, or extra clothing. For Japanese prisoners, the idea of being paid by the enemy was deeply confusing. In their experience, labor was obligation. It carried no compensation. To receive money for work, especially from captors, blurred the line between coercion and consent. Some refused to work initially, viewing it as collaboration. Others accepted, seeing labor as preferable to idleness. Over time, work details became routine. The guards, meanwhile, lived parallel lives just beyond the wire. They wore the same uniform daily, but when shifts ended, they returned to barracks equipped with radios, books, and newspapers. They received mail from home. They complained about food. They argued about baseball scores and movie stars. They were paid regularly and openly, their wages a common topic of conversation. Japanese prisoners observed this with growing attention. Here was an enemy military that enforced order without constant violence, a system where guards followed rules as strictly as prisoners did, where authority did not require humiliation, where obedience did not erase individuality. Even more unsettling was what lay outside the camp. Trains passed in the distance, civilian cars drove along nearby roads, towns existed beyond the fence, full of people untouched by the war's immediate destruction. Guards would leave their posts and disappear into that world, only to return the next day and resume their roles. Captivity, the prisoners realized, was not total. The United States did not require absolute submission of the self, only compliance with law. Within that framework, limited autonomy existed. Clubs were formed, language classes organized, art, music, and theater emerged organically. Some prisoners wrote poetry, others studied English. A few secretly documented camp life through sketches and journals. This freedom was not proclaimed, it was simply allowed. For men trained to believe that power must dominate every aspect of existence, this restraint was difficult to interpret. Was it weakness, confidence, indifference? The answer was not obvious. But as days turned into months, observation turned into reflection, and reflection, in some camps, turned into conflict, because not all prisoners interpreted this system the same way, and the differences between them would soon surface, forcing both captors and captives to confront the limits of discipline without fear.
When authority looked unfamiliar. From the moment Japanese prisoners settled into the rhythm of camp life, something felt misaligned. Not the fences, not the guards, but the way authority behaved. In the Imperial Japanese military, authority was visible through dominance. Orders were barked, not explained. Rank was reinforced through physical punishment and public humiliation. Fear was the instrument that kept men in line. A superior's power was unquestionable because it could be exercised at any moment. In American POW camps, that language of power was missing. Orders were posted on bulletin boards. Roll calls happened at scheduled times. Guards addressed prisoners through interpreters, sometimes politely, sometimes impersonally, but rarely with cruelty. When rules were broken, punishment followed procedure. There was paperwork, there were hearings, there was a structure that felt almost bureaucratic. To Japanese prisoners, this was deeply confusing. How could authority exist without constant intimidation? Why did guards not strike men who disobeyed? Why were punishments delayed, documented, and, most unsettling of all, consistent? Consistency implied something dangerous. It implied that the system did not depend on the emotional state of the man enforcing it. It meant power resided in the institution, not the individual. For prisoners accustomed to navigating a hierarchy defined by moods, favoritism, and violence, this impersonality was destabilizing. Some interpreted it as weakness. They whispered that Americans were soft, that their reluctance to use force proved moral fragility. A few tested boundaries, refusing orders, delaying compliance, speaking out of turn. Each time the response was the same: no escalation, no rage, just sanctions. Others saw something else. They noticed that guards followed the same rules every day, that even officers were bound by regulation, that punishments stopped at prescribed limits, that no one was beaten to make an example. The shock was not emotional, it was philosophical. If authority did not require cruelty, then cruelty was not authority. That realization, unspoken but persistent, began to erode assumptions that had once felt immovable. And it did not stop at how guards acted. It extended into how discipline itself was defined. Order enforced through restraint. Discipline was not absent in American camps. It was omnipresent, but expressed differently. Roll calls were mandatory. Barracks inspections were routine. Work details ran on schedule. Infractions were recorded meticulously. Escape attempts were met with swift response. Guards carried loaded weapons. Watchtowers were manned at all hours. Nothing about the system was lax. Yet for Japanese prisoners, the absence of physical punishment was more striking than the presence of control. In their training, discipline was inseparable from suffering. Pain was corrective. Endurance was proof of loyalty. Without hardship, obedience was meaningless. The American model contradicted this entirely. Discipline here was procedural. If a rule was broken, the consequence was predictable: loss of canteen privileges, confinement, reduction in recreation time, rarely solitary detention. The punishment was impersonal, and it ended when the rule book said it should. There was no public shaming, no beatings before assembled ranks, no arbitrary escalation. For some prisoners, this made discipline easier to endure. They could anticipate consequences and adjust behavior accordingly. For others, it created resentment. They believed punishment without suffering lacked moral weight, that it allowed weakness to persist. This divide mattered. Hardline prisoners, often former non-commissioned officers or men deeply committed to pre-war ideology, began to police behavior within the camps. They accused others of becoming complacent, of growing comfortable, of forgetting shame. They enforced discipline the way they knew how: through intimidation, through ostracism, through threats. American guards noticed tension, but often misunderstood its origin. From the outside, the camps appeared orderly. From within, pressure was mounting. The restraint that defined American authority was creating space that competing visions of discipline rushed to fill. And in that space, the meaning of obedience itself began to fracture.
when work was no longer punishment. Few details unsettled Japanese prisoners more than the idea of pay. Under Imperial Japanese doctrine, labor was duty. A soldier worked because he was ordered to. Compensation was irrelevant. To be paid implied a transaction, a voluntary exchange. That concept alone challenged the foundation of military obedience. Yet in American camps, labor came with wages. The amount was small, symbolic even, but it existed. Prisoners worked in fields harvesting crops, repaired roads, cut timber, or maintained camp facilities. At the end of each day, their labor was logged. Credits were added to personal accounts. They could spend that money. At canteens, prisoners bought soap, writing paper, snacks, even musical instruments. The choice itself was destabilizing. Labor was no longer simply endurance, it produced agency. What made this more disconcerting was that guards spoke openly about their own pay. They complained about low wages, compared ranks and benefits, joked about promotions. Money was not hidden, it was discussed casually, without reverence, without shame. For Japanese prisoners, this inverted hierarchy. The guard who enforced captivity also worked for pay. He could be dissatisfied, he could complain, he could still obey orders without believing them sacred. Authority, it seemed, did not require spiritual devotion. Some prisoners rejected this idea entirely. They refused paid labor, seeing it as collaboration or moral surrender. Others accepted, quietly justifying it as survival. Over time, participation increased, and with it came a dangerous realization. If work could be transactional, then obedience was not absolute, it was conditional. That realization did not yet explode into open conflict, but it lingered, reshaping how prisoners understood both their captors and themselves, because beyond discipline and labor lay something even more unsettling. The guard was not just an authority figure, he was an individual.
An enemy who went home at night. For many Japanese prisoners, the most disturbing realization was not how American guards enforced authority, but how they existed beyond it. In the Imperial Japanese military, individuality was systematically erased. Soldiers shared hardships, punishments, and identities. Personal desires were subordinate to the unit. A man's inner life was irrelevant to his function. To stand apart was dangerous. American guards did not fit this model. They stood watch with discipline, but when their shift ended, they left. They returned to barracks that were not cages. They wrote letters, listened to music, argued about sports. Some showed photographs of wives or children to fellow guards. Others read novels or played cards. Their lives continued beyond the fence. Japanese prisoners noticed this separation. The same man who counted heads at roll call would later laugh, relaxed, speaking casually to another guard. Authority was not permanent. It was worn, then removed. This fluidity unsettled prisoners who believed power must be constant to be real. Even more confusing was that guards disagreed with one another. They debated orders, questioned superiors, complained openly about food or assignments. Yet discipline did not collapse. Obedience persisted without silence. To Japanese prisoners, dissent within authority structures had always signaled decay. Here, it seemed routine. Some guards showed curiosity toward the prisoners. They asked questions through interpreters, commented on art or music produced inside the camp. A few learned basic Japanese phrases. None of this was required. This voluntary engagement complicated the enemy image. The guard was not a faceless enforcer. He was a man performing a role within limits, protected by rules. And because he could step out of that role, his authority felt paradoxically stronger. Power did not need to consume the individual to function. This observation lingered, and it fed into something larger, something prisoners struggled to articulate. because if authority could coexist with individuality, then obedience did not have to erase the self. That idea was dangerous. Privileges that felt like traps. Freedom, as Japanese prisoners understood it, was total or non-existent. One was either bound to duty or liberated through death. The notion of partial freedom, especially in captivity, felt incoherent. Yet American POW camps operated on precisely that principle. Within strict boundaries, choice existed. Prisoners could organize recreational activities. They formed baseball teams, sumo clubs, and theater groups. They held language classes, taught each other mathematics, history, and poetry. Religious observances were allowed. Some camps permitted the construction of small shrines or meditation spaces. Art emerged unexpectedly. Sketches of camp life, landscapes remembered from home, carefully folded origami. Music followed, flutes, stringed instruments, even improvised orchestras. Performances drew audiences, both prisoner and guard. This freedom was monitored, regulated, and revocable, but it was real. For some prisoners, these privileges became lifelines. They eased boredom, restored a sense of purpose, and offered moments of dignity. For others, they felt like traps. Hardliners warned that comfort dulled resistance, that art and study softened resolve, that enjoying captivity was a betrayal of the dead. They accused participants of forgetting their shame. American authorities saw these activities as stabilizing. Morale improved, discipline became easier to maintain, camps ran more smoothly. But beneath the surface, ideological fractures deepened. The freedom allowed inside the fence exposed divisions that violence would have suppressed. Men now chose how to respond to captivity. Some adapted, others resisted quietly. A few sought to reassert control through intimidation. Freedom, it turned out, was not universally welcomed. It forced decisions, and decisions forced accountability. When belief and experience collided. As weeks turned into months, Japanese prisoners lived in a state of cognitive tension. Everything they experienced contradicted what they had been taught. The enemy did not behave as expected. Captivity did not erase humanity. Discipline did not require cruelty. Authority did not demand submission of the soul. Yet accepting these truths carried a cost. To acknowledge the legitimacy of American conduct was to question the righteousness of their own system. To accept humane treatment was to confront the brutality they themselves had inflicted on prisoners across Asia. The moral ground beneath them began to shift. Some prisoners responded with denial. They dismissed American restraint as performance. They insisted cruelty would emerge eventually. They clung to ideology as armor against doubt. For these men, compromise was intolerable. Others experienced quiet disillusionment. They followed rules, participated in work, engaged in camp life. They did not renounce loyalty to Japan, but they began to separate loyalty from unquestioning obedience. Shame lingered, but it no longer defined every moment. This divergence created tension within barracks. Threats were whispered, notes were passed, informal tribunals formed. Men were accused of collaboration for minor infractions, speaking English too fluently, accepting privileges too readily, expressing gratitude toward guards. American officers observed rising anxiety but misread it as cultural reserve. The truth was more volatile. The camps were becoming ideological battlegrounds, not between captor and captive, but between prisoners themselves. And as pressure mounted, it became clear that discipline without fear could not prevent every kind of violence. Soon, restraint would be tested, and the consequences would force both sides to confront the limits of understanding.
When observation turned inward. By late 1943 and into 1944, The quiet order of several Japanese POW camps began to mask an internal crisis. From the outside, routines held. Roll calls were completed. Work details marched out under guard. Meals were distributed without incident. Reports filed by American officers often described conditions as stable. Inside the barracks, stability was unraveling. The central conflict was no longer between prisoner and guard, it was between interpretations of survival. Hardline prisoners, often senior enlisted men or former officers demoted by captivity, saw adaptation as contamination. They believed the American system was designed to erode loyalty through comfort. To them, every canteen purchase, every class attended, every performance staged was a step toward moral collapse. They acted accordingly. Informal hierarchies emerged. Barracks leaders were appointed without consent. Rules were enforced through intimidation. Men suspected of cooperating with American authorities were shunned. Some were threatened at night, away from watchtowers and patrol routes. The American guards, trained to watch for escape attempts in overt defiance, often missed these signs. Violence was not visible. Bruises were explained away as accidents. Silence was mistaken for discipline. But the pressure was constant. In several camps, prisoners were ordered by their peers to refuse work details. Others were told not to participate in recreational activities. Attendance at English classes or religious services was labeled disloyal. Men who resisted these internal edicts found themselves isolated. The most dangerous accusation was simple: loss of honor. In the Japanese military worldview, honor was communal. Once declared lost, it could not be reclaimed. To be labeled dishonorable was to be erased socially, even among the already defeated. This psychological siege pushed some prisoners to the edge. Reports from camps such as Camp McCoy in Wisconsin and Camp Tulu Lake in California documented rising incidents of self-harm and suicide among Japanese prisoners. These acts were rarely dramatic. They were quiet, methodical, and rooted in despair rather than protest. American medical officers were often unprepared for the depth of this crisis. They traded wounds, recorded deaths, filed reports, but the underlying cause, ideological implosion, was difficult to quantify. Meanwhile, American authorities attempted corrective measures. Prisoners deemed disruptive were transferred. Camps were reorganized. In some cases, Japanese POWs were segregated from German and Italian prisoners to reduce friction. Educational programs were expanded under the belief that engagement reduced unrest. In some camps, it worked. In others, it intensified resistance. Because the more freedom the system allowed, the more responsibility fell on the individual. And for men trained to see obedience as salvation, responsibility was unbearable. The turning point came not in a single dramatic explosion, but in a series of escalating confrontations, moments when American restraint met ideological extremism head-on. And in those moments, discipline would be enforced, not just to maintain order, but to prevent collapse.
When restraint reached its limit. The breaking point did not arrive suddenly. It arrived through accumulation. By 1944, American camp commanders were confronting a pattern they could no longer dismiss as isolated incidents. Reports of intimidation, coerced conformity, and internal violence among Japanese prisoners increased. What had once appeared as cultural reserve was now recognized as organized pressure. At camps such as Camp McCoy and Camp Tulu Lake, U.S. intelligence officers began to identify factionalism. Prisoners who accepted work, education, or recreation were labeled weak. Others, often those clinging most fiercely to pre-war ideology, positioned themselves as moral enforcers. The situation demanded intervention. American authorities responded with a tool they trusted: structure. Suspected ringleaders were isolated. Barracks were reorganized to break up informal power centers. Roll calls became more frequent, surveillance increased, interpreters were used more aggressively to gather information. Camp regulations were clarified and posted in Japanese. Still, the underlying conflict persisted. In several instances, internal threats escalated into physical violence. Prisoners were assaulted at night. In rare but serious cases, knives improvised from camp tools were used. The violence was not random, it was targeted, ideological, and meant to enforce conformity. For American guards, this posed a dilemma. They were responsible for the safety of prisoners under their care, yet intervening too forcefully risked confirming the hardliners' narrative that American authority was ultimately brutal. Doing nothing risked deaths. In response, commanders made a decisive shift. They enforced discipline directly. Guards conducted surprise inspections, weapons were confiscated, suspected agitators were placed in segregation. In extreme cases, prisoners were transferred to higher security facilities designed for ideological containment. Force was used, but sparingly and according to regulation. When guards entered barracks to break up fights or remove ringleaders, they did so in formation. Orders were given clearly. Compliance was expected. Resistance was met with physical restraint, not reprisal. For Japanese prisoners, this moment was revelatory. Here was American authority, fully exercised, controlled, impersonal, and overwhelming. There was no rage, no spectacle, just action followed by documentation. The illusion of American softness collapsed. At the same time, another illusion shattered. The belief that discipline required cruelty could no longer hold. The American system demonstrated that power could be decisive without being vindictive, that order could be restored without humiliation. The internal hierarchies among prisoners weakened. Fear lost its grip. Men who had lived under threat found space to breathe, not because freedom expanded, but because violence receded. This turning point did not end ideological conflict, but it changed its balance. For the first time, many prisoners saw American discipline not as a facade, but as a coherent moral framework, one that did not depend on terror to function. And with that realization came a deeper reckoning. Because the war outside the fences was moving towards its own conclusion, and when it ended, these men would have to carry what they had learned back into a world that had already declared them dead.
The war ends. The reckoning begins. In August 1945, the war that had defined captivity ended abruptly. News reached American POW camps in fragments, first rumors, then official announcements. Interpreters stood before assembled prisoners and read carefully worded statements. Japan had accepted the terms of surrender. The emperor had spoken. Hostilities had ceased. For many Japanese prisoners, the moment felt unreal. They had been trained to believe defeat was impossible, that the homeland would fight to annihilation, that surrender was a Western concept, incompatible with imperial destiny. Now the unthinkable had occurred, not just individually, but nationally. Reactions varied. Some prisoners wept openly. Others stood in silence, faces fixed, unmoving. A few refused to believe the reports, insisting they were American psychological operations. Several attempted suicide in the days that followed, unable to reconcile survival with national defeat. American camp authorities responded cautiously. Guards were instructed to maintain order but show restraint. Chaplains and medical staff were placed on alert. Work schedules were reduced. Recreational activities were encouraged as stabilizing measures. The priority was preventing violence toward others or the self. Gradually, confirmation arrived. Photographs of the devastated cities, translated excerpts from the emperor's broadcast, official documents bearing seals. The reality settled in. Japan had lost. For prisoners who had already lived with the shame of capture, this compounded the psychological burden. They were no longer just individuals who had failed, they were survivors of a defeated nation. Repatriation planning began almost immediately.
American authorities compiled records, medical examinations were conducted, prisoners were informed they would be returned home, not punished. Many struggled to accept this. They expected trials, retaliation, death. Instead, they were told they would go home. Home, however, was no longer the place they remembered. Reports filtered in about destroyed cities, food shortages, and occupation forces. The emperor, once divine, had renounced his divinity. The military institutions that had defined their lives were dissolving. For some prisoners, the months between surrender and repatriation became a period of intense reflection. They reviewed years of indoctrination against lived experience. They compared the brutality they had been taught to expect with the restraint they had witnessed daily. They recalled guards who had enforced rules without hatred, who had exercised power without humiliation. American officers compiled their own assessments. Reports noted that Japanese POWs had, over time, become more cooperative, more open to dialogue, and more willing to engage in education. Intelligence summaries suggested that exposure to American military discipline, distinct from violence, had altered perceptions of authority. Not uniformly, not completely, but measurably. As transport ships were prepared and camps began to empty, the fences that once defined captivity took on a different meaning. They had confined bodies, but they had also contained an experiment, one that neither side had fully intended. And as the prisoners boarded ships bound for a defeated homeland, they carried more than memories of captivity. They carried comparisons.
The long echo of captivity. The journey home was quiet. Japanese prisoners traveled across the Pacific in orderly convoys, under supervision but without chains. Many stood on deck for hours, watching the horizon, rehearsing conversations that might never happen. Some feared rejection, others feared silence more. When they arrived, the reality of post-war Japan confirmed their unease. Cities lay flattened, infrastructure was shattered, food was scarce. Families had survived years of bombing, deprivation, and loss. The Imperial Army and Navy no longer existed as institutions of power. Officers who had once commanded absolute obedience now stood unemployed, discredited, or invisible. For former POWs, reintegration was uneven. Some returned to families who believed them dead and welcomed them with relief. Others encountered suspicion or quiet shame. Capture still carried stigma even after national surrender. Survival itself was complicated. Yet, something had changed. In interviews conducted years later, former Japanese POWs repeatedly described captivity in the United States as disorienting, but formative. They did not speak of kindness in sentimental terms. They spoke of structure, of predictability, of a system where authority did not require degradation. For men raised under a military doctrine that equated obedience with suffering, this distinction mattered. Several former prisoners later became teachers, civil servants, or local officials in post-war Japan. Some participated in labor unions or civic organizations. Others remained silent, carrying their experiences privately. But across these divergent paths, a common thread emerged, a recalibration of how power could function. American military analysts took note as well. Post-war evaluations of POW management highlighted the relative stability of camps that emphasized consistent discipline over coercion. Reports concluded that predictability reduced unrest, while regulated freedom mitigated radicalization. These lessons were quietly absorbed into Cold War doctrine, influencing how the United States would manage prisoners and occupied populations in future conflicts. The legacy was not celebratory, it was instructional. The camps were not utopias, they were sites of tension, misunderstanding, and occasional tragedy.
but they demonstrated something rare in wartime, a controlled environment where restraint was tested against ideology. For Japanese POWs, the experience fractured assumptions that had once felt eternal, not through argument or propaganda, but through observation, through watching guards obey rules they did not invent, through seeing authority exercised without cruelty, through recognizing freedom not as indulgence but as responsibility. These realizations did not erase loyalty or pain, they coexisted with them. And in that coexistence lay the quiet power of the experience. Because when former prisoners returned to a Japan being reshaped under occupation, its constitution rewritten, its military dissolved, its society forced to reconsider the nature of authority, they were not encountering these ideas for the first time. They had already seen them, in fragments, behind barbed wire. And they understood how unsettling they could be.
Discipline, freedom, and the lessons beyond the fence. The fences have long been gone. The camps, the roll calls, the pay envelopes and canteens, they exist now only in memory, in photographs, in the pages of reports filed decades ago. Yet their lessons endure, quiet and unassuming, like the morning air in those Midwestern compounds. Japanese prisoners had entered captivity expecting punishment. They had anticipated cruelty, domination, and the erasure of self. What they found instead was a different form of power, a discipline that was firm but impartial, an authority that enforced order without demeaning the individual, and a freedom that was bounded yet real. It was a freedom that unsettled them more than chains ever could. It forced decisions, created moral responsibility, and illuminated the limits of ideology. They observed, reflected, and sometimes resisted. They learned that strength could coexist with restraint, that obedience need not require suffering, and that authority could function without intimidation. For the American Guards, this was never framed as philosophical experiment. It was routine, procedure, law. Yet it left its mark, shaping interactions, preserving lives, and demonstrating a principle often lost in war, that humane order can be as decisive as force. History remembers battles, casualties, and strategies, but sometimes it is the quiet collisions between expectation and reality, ideology and observation that leave the deepest imprint. The camps were not utopias, they were sites of tension, fear, and occasional tragedy, yet they offered proof that power exercised responsibly changes not only the captives but the captors and reverberates far beyond the moment. In the lives of those Japanese POWs, in the subtle recalibration of belief, and in the long shadows of post-war Japan, we see the paradox of captivity, that constraint, when balanced with dignity and fairness, can awaken insight, preserve life, and leave a mark more enduring than any victory on the battlefield. And so, behind barbed wire, in the quiet discipline of a Midwestern morning, an unlikely lesson was taught, that freedom, even a limited, regulated freedom, can be as disarming as any weapon.